fired in front of three major investors at 3:04 p.m. But just 25 minutes later, my name appeared on their $2.1 billion deal. They thought I'd gone silent to endure the humiliation. I was only quiet so they wouldn't hear the sound of me pulling the rug out from under their feet. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a scream. It's a signature on the right document at exactly the right moment. My name is Madeline Ross, and for 17 years, I built empires for other people to rule. The conference room on the 47th floor of Landon Mercer Capital had witnessed countless deals, but none quite like the public execution Derek Vaughan had planned for me that Thursday afternoon. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline stretched endlessly, a testament to ambition and power, qualities I'd spent nearly 2 decades cultivating, only to watch them mean nothing in this moment. I sat across from three of the most influential investors in renewable energy: Johann Meyer from Rhineland Investment Fund, Felix Romero of Trident Capital, and Samantha Laird, the formidable chairwoman of Northgate Holdings. Combined, they controlled over $15 billion in assets. The transcontinental renewable energy project we were finalizing would revolutionize clean power distribution across 3 continents. I had orchestrated every partnership, navigated every regulatory hurdle, and built every bridge that made this moment possible. Derek Vaughan, our CEO for the past 18 months, stood at the head of the table in his signature charcoal Armani suit, the one he'd bought after his 3rd TED Talk went viral. He was all polish and no substance, a master of buzzwords who couldn't tell you the difference between a power purchase agreement and a pizza order without my briefings. Before we proceed with the signing, Derek announced, his voice carrying that practiced gravity he'd perfected in front of mirrors, I need to address a critical change in our leadership structure. The air shifted. Johann's steel-gray eyes found mine, a question forming behind his wire-rimmed glasses. I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse quickened. This wasn't on the agenda. Effective immediately, Derek continued, not even granting me the courtesy of eye contact. Madeline Ross will no longer serve as VP of Global Investment Strategy. We need someone more agile for the challenges ahead, someone who understands the new paradigm we're creating. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. 17 years of loyalty, of missed birthdays and canceled vacations, of building this company's international presence from nothing, reduced to a public termination in front of the very people whose trust I'd earned deal by deal, handshake by handshake. Felix shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Samantha's fingers paused over her Mont Blanc pen, but no one spoke. In this world, you don't defend the fallen, you step over them. Madeline. Derek finally deigned to look at me, his smile as hollow as his understanding of the contracts he was about to sign. We'll have security escort you out. Your personal items will be sent to your home address. I rose from my chair with deliberate calm, smoothing my navy blazer, the same one I'd worn to my first international negotiation in Frankfurt, where I'd saved a failing wind farm project and earned Johann's respect. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't waver. I simply nodded, gathered my leather portfolio, and walked toward the door. Thank you for 17 remarkable years, I said, pausing at the threshold. My tone was even, professional, giving nothing away. I wish you all the best with the signing. The door clicked shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the hallway. But as I walked past the executive assistants pretending not to stare, past the achievements and accolades lining the walls, many bearing my name, I didn't feel the sting of humiliation Derek had intended. Because Derek Vaughan, in his arrogance and stupidity, had just activated a plan 6 months in the making. He thought he was conducting my funeral. He had no idea he was performing his own. The elevator descended in silence, each floor marking another step away from the life I'd built. But as I watched the numbers tick down, my mind drifted back through the years, not in nostalgia, but in calculation. Every slight, every stolen credit, every moment that led to this perfectly orchestrated disaster. I started at Landon Mercer as an intern, fresh from Wharton with ambition that could fill Lake Michigan. Back then, the company was a modest investment firm with big dreams and small reach. I was the one who pushed us international, who spent sleepless nights learning German tax law and Japanese corporate culture. I was the one who transformed handshakes into partnerships, suspicion into trust. The Frankfurt incident 5 years ago had been my defining moment. A $400 million wind farm project in Brandenburg was hemorrhaging money, 3 weeks from bankruptcy. The previous team had bungled negotiations so badly that German regulators were ready to pull permits. Derek, then newly appointed as CFO, wanted to cut losses and run. But I saw opportunity where he saw failure. I flew to Berlin without approval, armed only with my laptop and a deep understanding of German environmental law I'd acquired through countless late nights. For 2 weeks, I lived on coffee and determination, restructuring the entire deal from the ground up. When Johann Meyer walked into that conference room representing Rhineland Investment Fund, he expected to preside over a corporate funeral. Instead, he found a resurrection. If they ever fail to see your worth, Johann had told me after we'd saved the project, his English accented but precise. You call me. Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted on people who can't appreciate it. I'd smiled and filed the comment away, never expecting to need it. But that was before Derek's meteoric rise to CEO, fueled more by his social media presence than actual competence. He was brilliant at one thing: taking credit. Every successful negotiation I closed became his vision. Every partnership I forged became his relationship. And I let it happen, because I believed in the work more than the recognition. 6 months ago, everything changed. I discovered a pattern in Derek's contract reviews, or rather, his complete lack of them. He'd sign anything that looked impressive, trusting his legal team to handle the details. That's when I began laying the groundwork for Ross Stratagem Holdings, LLC, a lean consulting firm incorporated in Delaware with one purpose: to serve as my lifeboat when the ship inevitably sank. The masterstroke came when Derek asked me to draft our new vendor independence policy, a bureaucratic document he assumed no one would read. Buried on page 47, in subsection 3.2.4, I embedded a clause that would change everything if any senior executive involved in international partnerships was terminated without documented cause. Their negotiation rights would automatically transfer to any pre-registered independent entity they controlled. Derek had signed it without reading past the executive summary, praising my attention to detail in an all-staff email. But the policy alone wasn't enough. I needed the perfect storm, a deal so large, so complex, that losing control of it would destroy Derek. The Transcontinental Renewable Project was that storm. For months, I'd carefully structured every agreement to reference that obscure clause, creating a legal maze that only I could navigate. Derek, confident in his power over me, never bothered to understand what he was signing. The elevator opened to the marble lobby, afternoon sunlight streaming through glass walls. Security was already waiting, 2 guards I'd known for years, looking uncomfortable with their assignment. I handed them my badge without drama, maintaining the composure that had served me through 1,000 negotiations. As I walked through those doors for what Derek believed was the last time, my phone buzzed. A text from Emily Carter, my former assistant whom I'd strategically recommended for Derek's team. Folder 9 status, missing as requested. The second phase had begun. The beauty of a well-laid trap is its invisibility. For 6 months, I'd woven a web so intricate that even I sometimes marveled at its complexity. Now, as I sat in my Range Rover in the parking garage, I could picture exactly what was unfolding 47 floors above. The vendor independence policy had been my Trojan horse, but the real genius lay in how I'd implemented it. Every international contract I'd negotiated in the past 6 months contained a peculiar addendum, a reference to VIP Protocol 3.2.4 that required specific authentication procedures. Derek, drowning in his own ego, had approved them all with his digital signature, joking that I was overly cautious with paperwork. He had no idea that each signature was another nail in his professional coffin. Ross Stratagem Holdings, LLC wasn't just a backup plan. It was a fully operational shadow structure. I'd filed the incorporation papers in Delaware 6 months ago, listing myself as CEO and sole shareholder. The company specialized in international renewable energy consulting, with pre-existing agreements with key suppliers and regulatory bodies across Europe and Asia. Relationships I'd built personally over 17 years, documented carefully to show they predated my employment at Landon Mercer. The masterstroke was the authentication process. 2 weeks ago, I'd sent a routine memo to all international partners, informing them of a security upgrade for the transcontinental project. Going forward, any changes to negotiation leadership would require verification through Folder 9, a secure document package containing biometric data, authentication codes, and legal authorities. Only one copy existed, and it was currently in my home safe, not in the Landon Mercer servers. Emily Carter had been crucial to this phase. I'd mentored her for 3 years, and when Derek demanded a new executive assistant who was hungry and naive, I'd enthusiastically recommended her. What Derek didn't know was that Emily's hunger was for justice, not approval. Her sister had been laid off by Derek's previous company in a brutal downsizing that funded his executive bonuses. Emily had her own reasons for ensuring Folder 9 would be mysteriously absent when needed. My phone buzzed. Johann Meyer. Interesting development in the meeting. Call when convenient. I didn't call. Not yet. The sequence had to be perfect. Instead, I drove to the offices of Berkeley & Myers LLP, where Jonathan Myers himself was waiting in the conference room. Jonathan had been my law school study partner, and more importantly, he'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. "The transfer documents are ready," he said, sliding a leather folder across the mahogany table. "The moment Derek's termination of you became effective, Clause 3.2.4, activated. Ross Stratagem Holdings now has exclusive negotiation rights for any international partnership you personally established." "Which would be?" I let the question hang. "All of them." Jonathan's smile was sharp as a blade. "Every single international component of the transcontinental project. Roughly 73% of the total deal value." I reviewed the documents carefully, though I'd memorized every word weeks ago. The legal framework was bulletproof. Derek had signed away his authority the moment he'd fired me without cause in front of witnesses. The fact that those witnesses happened to be the 3 primary investors was poetic justice. "There's one more thing," Jonathan added, producing another document. "Felix Romero's legal team just sent this over. They're invoking the authentication protocol for any structural changes to the deal. They need Folder 9. I glanced at my watch, 3:19 p.m. Derek would be scrambling now, demanding I'd locate a folder that existed only in physical form. Emily would be apologetically explaining that she couldn't find it in the system, that perhaps Ms. Ross had handled it personally given its sensitive nature, and the investors, Johann, Felix, and Samantha, would be sitting in that conference room, watching Derek's polished facade crack under the weight of his own ignorance. They'd built empires by recognizing competence and crushing pretenders. Derek had just revealed which category he belonged to. My phone buzzed again. "Emily." He's starting to panic. "Should I mention the authentication requirement?" I typed back. "Wait 5 more minutes, then innocently suggest they might need to contact me." The trap was set. All that remained was to let Derek thrash himself to pieces in it. The conference room had transformed from Derek's stage into his interrogation chamber. Through Emily's carefully timed updates, I could visualize every excruciating detail. The polished mahogany table where I'd spent countless hours building this empire now reflected the faces of 3 increasingly impatient billionaires. "What do you mean you can't locate the authentication folder?" Samantha Laird's voice could freeze blood when she chose, and according to Emily's text, she was choosing now. "This is a $2.1 billion transaction, Mr. Vaughn, not a lunch order." Derek's rehearsed confidence was evaporating like morning dew under an unforgiving sun. He'd walked into that room expecting to sign his name to glory. Instead, he was discovering that every document required verification protocols he'd never bothered to understand. "I'm sure it's just a minor administrative oversight," Derek attempted, his voice carrying that thin edge of desperation I'd heard only once before, when he'd nearly tanked a sole negotiation by insulting our Korean partner's business customs. I'd saved him then, not today. Felix Romero, ever direct, cut through the pretense. Minor. We're talking about Folder 9, the authentication package your own memo designated as critical for international partnerships. The memo you signed, if I'm not mistaken. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily later told me she could actually hear Derek swallow. Johann Meyer, meanwhile, had been quietly reviewing his phone. I knew what he was reading, the pre-registration documents for Ross Stratagem Holdings I'd filed with the European Energy Consortium 6 months ago, establishing my company as a recognized entity for renewable energy negotiations. All perfectly legal, all perfectly timed. Perhaps, Johann said slowly, his accented English carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many pretenders fall. We should discuss the elephant in the room, or rather, the person who just left it. Madeline Ross is no longer with the company, Derek said, trying to reclaim control. I've made the decision to take our strategic partnerships in a new direction. Have you? Samantha's laugh was devoid of humor. Because according to subsection 3.2, 4 of your own vendor independence policy, which my legal team naturally reviewed, her termination without documented cause triggers some rather interesting provisions. Emily chose that moment to execute her role perfectly. Mr. Vaughn, she said, maintaining the tremulous voice of a nervous assistant. I've searched everywhere for Folder 9. The only record shows Ms. Ross personally managed it due to its sensitive nature. Should I try to contact her? The trap had fully closed, but Derek still didn't comprehend its magnitude. In his mind, he could simply override any bureaucratic hiccup, charm his way through any obstacle. He'd never understood that in international business, contracts were sacred, and the details he'd dismissed as tedious were actually the foundations of power. That won't be necessary, Derek said, jaw tight. We'll proceed with nothing. Felix interrupted, standing. Trident Capital doesn't invest billions based on executive assurances. We invest based on legal frameworks. And right now, your framework is showing some spectacular gaps. Johann was already typing on his phone. I knew who he was messaging, his senior legal counsel, the same team that had worked with me on the Frankfurt deal. They'd find Ross Stratagem Holdings, fully registered, fully compliant, and fully authorized to handle exactly the kind of negotiations Derek had just lost control of. Gentlemen, Ms. Laird. Derek's voice had shifted from confident to conciliatory. I'm sure we can resolve this minor documentation issue. My team will locate the necessary files within the hour. Your team? Samantha stood as well, gathering her documents. You just fired the person who apparently holds the keys to this kingdom. That's not a minor issue. Mr. Vaughn, that's catastrophic incompetence. Emily sent another update. Johann just asked for a recess, said he needs to make some calls. Derek's face is the color of ash. I looked at my watch. 3:24 p.m. 5 more minutes until the final phase. 5 more minutes until Derek Vaughn learned that in the game of corporate chess, the queen was always the most powerful piece, especially when the king was too arrogant to protect her. At 3:26 p.m., I sent the message that would end Derek Vaughn's career. Folder 9, transferred to Ross Stratagem Holdings as per VIP Protocol Series 3.2.4. Authentication codes available upon request. M. Ross. I sent it to Johann first, knowing his reaction would set the tone for what followed. Within seconds, my phone lit up with his call. I let it ring twice before answering. Madeline. His voice carried a mixture of admiration and amusement. I should have known you wouldn't leave quietly. I never said I was leaving, Johann. I said I wished you all the best with the signing, and I meant it, just not with Landon Mercer. The sound of his quiet laughter was worth 6 months of preparation. The registration documents for Ross Stratagem Holdings landed in my inbox 30 seconds ago. My legal team confirms you've had authentication rights since the moment Derek terminated you, Impressive. I learned from the best, I replied, remembering his lessons from Frankfurt. Never enter a negotiation without controlling the exit. Johann excused himself to return to the conference room, and I switched my phone to speaker as Jonathan Myers pulled up the live legal filing system. The beauty of modern corporate law was its transparency. Every document, every transfer, every authentication was time-stamped and traceable. Emily's next text was almost gleeful. Johann just announced you have folder 9. Derek actually stammered. The final phase unfolded with surgical precision. Through Emily's real-time updates and Jonathan's legal monitoring, I watched Derek's empire crumble in minutes. 3:27 p.m. Johann formally announced to the room that Ross Stratagem Holdings possessed the authentication documents and, more critically, the legal standing to complete the international portions of the deal. 3:28 p.m. Berkeley and Myers LLP filed official notice with all three investment funds confirming the automatic transfer of negotiation rights per clause 3.2.4. 3:28:30 p.m. Samantha Laird's legal team responded, acknowledging Ross Stratagem as the authorized negotiating entity for Northgate Holdings. 3:28:45 p.m. Felix Romero's team followed suit for Trident Capital. 3:29 p.m. The moment of truth. Ms. Ross, Jonathan said, sliding the signature page across the conference table. As CEO of Ross Stratagem Holdings, you're now authorized to execute this agreement. The pen felt familiar in my hand, the same Mont Blanc I'd used to sign my first international deal. But this signature carried different weight. This wasn't just business. This was vindication. As I signed my name with deliberate precision, my phone buzzed with a message from Derek himself. You planned this? Not a question, a statement. The first intelligent observation he'd made all day. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He'd played his power card, public humiliation, and I'd played mine, competence. In our world, only one of those had real value. The confirmation came through seconds later. Transaction authorized, Ross Stratagem Holdings, lead partner, Transcontinental Renewable Energy Initiative. Value, $2.1 billion. Emily's final update painted the picture I'd orchestrated but would never see. Derek just received the notification. He's standing at the head of the table, mouth open, while the investors pack up. Johann said something in German that made Felix laugh. Samantha told Derek her lawyers would be in touch about this spectacular breach of fiduciary duty. The room is emptying. Derek is alone. At Landon Mercer Capital, I'd spent 17 years building bridges to power. Derek had spent 18 months burning them. The difference was, I'd kept the architectural plans. Congratulations, Jonathan said, closing the folder. Ross Stratagem Holdings is now officially one of the major players in renewable energy. What's next? I stood, smoothing my blazer one final time. Next, I build something worth keeping. Something where competence matters more than charisma. As I left Berkeley and Myers, my phone showed 17 missed calls from Derek, 12 from Landon Mercer's board of directors, and one text from Johann. Welcome to the kingdom you've always deserved to rule. Jay. The Chicago skyline looked different from street level, less imposing, more inviting. At 3:04 p.m., Derek Vaughn had tried to destroy my career. By 3:29 p.m., I'd returned the favor. The difference was, I'd done it legally. The signing ceremony at Berkeley and Myers was everything Derek's theatrics could never be. Efficient, professional, and legally bulletproof. I sat at the polished conference table, surrounded not by ego and pretense, but by some of the sharpest legal minds in Chicago. Jonathan Myers had assembled his senior team, each one a specialist in international corporate law. Page by page, Jonathan instructed, laying out the documents with practiced precision. Every signature needs to be perfect. Derek's lawyers will be looking for any technicality to challenge this. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The contract was a masterpiece of complexity. 2,847 pages detailing energy distribution across 17 countries. regulatory compliance in 4 languages, and financial structures that would make most CFOs weep. I knew every clause, every subsection, every carefully negotiated term. Because, unlike Derek, I'd never considered the details beneath me. As I initialed page after page, my phone continued its symphony of notifications. I'd silenced it. But the screen lit up constantly. Landon Mercer's board, former colleagues, competitors who'd already heard whispers of the coup. The business world was small at this level, and news of Derek's catastrophic failure was spreading like wildfire through private networks. Section 47B, Jonathan noted, sliding another page forward. This one's particularly interesting. It specifies that any attempt to reverse the authentication transfer would require unanimous approval from all international partners. Which they'll never give, I said, signing with satisfaction. Not after today's performance. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Jonathan's junior associates fielding calls, their expressions growing more amazed with each conversation. The story was already becoming legend. The executive who'd engineered her own termination trap, who'd turned corporate betrayal into a $2.1 billion opportunity. At exactly 3:29 p.m., I'd insisted on the symbolic timing. I signed the final page. Congratulations, Ms. Ross, Jonathan said formally, as his team members applauded. Ross Stratagem Holdings is now the primary controlling partner for the international segments of the Transcontinental Renewable Energy Initiative. I stood, accepting their congratulations with quiet grace. But the day wasn't over. There was one more scene to play. The moment I stepped out of Berkeley and Myers, Emily was waiting by the elevators. She'd left Landon Mercer the instant the meeting concluded. Her resignation letter, prepared weeks ago, left on Derek's desk alongside her building access card. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, handing me a leather portfolio. Inside was folder 9, complete and untouched. "Kept it safe, just like you asked." "You didn't have to resign," I said, though we both knew it was lie. Her part in this had been dangerous enough. "Are you kidding?" Emily's smile was fierce. After watching Derek realize he'd been outplayed by the very person he tried to humiliate, that was worth 10 years' salary. Besides, she glanced at the Ross Stratagem Holdings logo now displayed on my phone screen. "I hear there's a new renewable energy firm that might be hiring." We rode the elevator down together, 2 women who'd refused to be casualties of corporate ego. In the lobby, more familiar faces waited, several of Landon Mercer's top performers, the ones who'd built real value rather than just talked about it. They'd all received the same message an hour ago. Ross Stratagem Holdings is interviewing, only substance need apply. My phone buzzed with a message from Samantha Laird. "Dinner tomorrow? Northgate has 3 more projects that need someone who actually reads contracts." Then Felix. "Trident's board wants to meet Tuesday. Bring that folder 9. They want to see what competent documentation looks like." But it was Johan's call I finally answered as I walked through the building's revolving doors into the bright Chicago afternoon. "Derek's board just called an emergency meeting," he said without preamble. "Trading's been suspended, pending investigation into executive incompetence. Conservative estimate, he'll be gone by morning." "I take no pleasure in that," I said, and meant it. "Mostly." "Of course not." Johan's tone was knowing. "By the way, the Frankfurt team sends their regards. They're eager to work with someone who remembers their names again." As I stood on the sidewalk where Derek had expected me to slink away in disgrace, I felt the weight of the moment. Not triumph, that was too simple. This was transformation, from employee to owner, from builder to architect, from the woman who saved deals to the woman who made them. My watch read 3:47 p.m. In 43 minutes, I'd gone from fired to funded, from discarded to dominant. All because Derek Vaughan had made the fatal mistake of confusing silence with surrender. The Landon Mercer Capitol building cast its shadow across the plaza as I walked past one final time. Through the towering glass facade, I could see the executive floor where my career had supposedly ended just over an hour ago. Now, That same building would watch Ross Stratagem Holdings rise from its ashes. Emily waited by my Range Rover. Her resignation already processed by HR, her future already secured with my new company. Around us, the city moved with its usual urgency, unaware that one of its corporate titans had just fallen to his own arrogance. The news just broke, Emily said, showing me her phone. The financial blogs were already running with it. Landon Mercer loses $2.1 billion deal in executive shakeup. Derek Vaughn's leadership under fire as major initiative transfers to former VP's firm. Ross Stratagem Holdings emerges as new power player in renewable energy. I didn't read them. The real story was far more complex than any headline could capture. My phone showed one final message from Derek. The board wants my resignation. You destroyed everything. For the first time since 3:04 p.m., I typed a response. No, Derek. You destroyed everything. I just documented it. As Emily and I drove away from the building that had been my second home for 17 years, I thought about the nature of power. Derek had believed it came from titles and corner offices, from the ability to humiliate and discard. But real power came from competence, from relationships built on trust, from reading every page of every contract while others chased spotlight moments. So what now? Emily asked as we merged into traffic. Now we build, I said simply. Not for someone else's ego. Not for someone else's credit. We build something that matters. The Chicago skyline faded in my rearview mirror, but I wasn't leaving anything behind. Everything that mattered, every relationship, every piece of expertise, every hard-won lesson, came with me. The only thing I'd left at Landon Mercer was a CEO who'd just learned that in business. As in chess, you should never underestimate the queen. By 5 p.m., Ross Stratagem Holdings had received partnership inquiries from 12 international firms. By 6 p.m., 3 of Landon Mercer's top engineers had submitted resumes. By 7 p.m., Derek Vaughn had submitted his resignation to the board, effective immediately. But I wasn't tracking those victories anymore. I was having dinner with my team, the brilliant, overlooked professionals who'd helped engineer the greatest corporate comeback in Chicago history. We didn't toast Derek's downfall. We toasted something better. The moment when being fired became the best thing that ever happened to me. Because sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. The news would call it revenge. The analysts would call it a hostile takeover. Derek would call it betrayal. I called it justice, clean, precise, and served at exactly the right temperature. As the sun set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, I thought about everyone who'd ever been publicly humiliated by a lesser person with greater power. Everyone who'd built kingdoms for others to rule. Everyone who'd been told they weren't agile enough for the new paradigm. This was for all of us. Because in the end, competence doesn't whisper. It doesn't need to shout, either. It just signs its name on the right line at the right time and lets the lawyers handle the rest. My name is Madeline Ross. I was fired at 3:04 p.m. in front of 3 billionaire investors. By 3:29 p.m., I owned the deal they came to sign. And that's how you pull the rug out from under someone who never bothered to check what they were standing on. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate justice. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across continents. If this tale of turning termination into triumph resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about facing down workplace injustice. Your stories inspire mine.